She only introduced you and then she left.
I've been trying to read. I could probably half of my papers and I'm in a busy time, I guess, Wednesday at noon. I don't know who wrote this out.
Hi, everybody. Today, I would like to introduce one of our very own, Megumi Asada. For those that don't know them, they are a stellar third-year PhD candidate in math education under the advisement of Dr. Keith Weber. Their research interest is in abolitionist and emancipatory abilities in advanced undergraduate math courses and opportunities to tie advanced mathematics to the development of students' political. Prior to Rutgers, Megumi taught algebra in a high school in the Bronx. And they hold a master's of philosophy and criminology from the University of Cambridge and a BA in mathematics with honors from Williams College. Currently, they have been working on the Courage Project here at Rutgers, and through the Prism Lab at Vanderbilt, they are working on 2 projects, TIPS, which stands for Transformative Inclusion in Post-Secondary STEM, and QSOC, which is Queer Students of Color in STEM. Without further ado.
Thank you so much for that introduction. That was so lovely. So I'll be talking about undergraduate instructors' perceptions of barriers to implementing culture-sustaining practices. But first, I wanted to motivate this work a little bit and just kind of talk about why it really matters that we kind of look into equitable practices in undergraduate math. So just like many areas of school, undergraduate math can be highly inequitable, and this is particularly the case for Black and Latino students. And students of underrepresented genders. Often various instructional practices paired with broader myths about ability end up creating a hostile environment for historically marginalized students. So when I say a hostile environment, often this can come, like one way that it can manifest is Black and Latino students being weeded out of intro calculus courses. And then the few who end up persisting through the major might have fewer same gender, same peer support systems that their other peers might have access to. But unfortunately, there's been relatively a little work documenting supportive practices in undergraduate math, and specifically practices that directly disrupt racialized and gendered experiences. We have some sense of like broad general practices that work for everyone, but not necessarily ones that are kind of targeted that work against some of these racialized and gendered norms. One possibility for creating more equitable math environments is for instructors to take on what are called culture-sustaining pedagogies, which I'll define in a minute. So accordingly, the research question that I was what do doctoral student instructors of math undergraduates perceive to be the barriers to implementing culture-sustaining practices? And what to emphasize here, okay, that's not coming up, but that's okay. Specifically, I was looking into doctoral student instructors, and there's generally 2 advantages to this. So when I say doctoral student instructors, I mean current math PhDs who taught some undergraduate math. The benefit of this population is that on the first hand, like unlike more maybe established older faculty, they're probably more likely to be a bit more receptive towards equitable practices. I think on the other hand, they're also going to be the future professoriate, so I think they're interesting to study in their own right. And I think I really was interested in this case to understand what the most potentially receptive people perceive to be genuine barriers to CSP. Okay, so let's quickly define what culture-sustaining pedagogy is. So the kind of crux of CSP is that effective instruction promotes 3 things. So student achievement, cultural competence, and critical. And really the idea is that students learn best when they see their cultures and lives reflected in what they're learning. This is kind of under the umbrella of what are called asset-based pedagogy. But they really try to value the everyday mathematics you can really bring into the classroom as opposed to kind of seeing them as blank slates that information is going to be imposed upon. But notably, most CSP work has been done in the K-12 setting, with the exception of one paper in linear algebra that uses some elements of CSP. So I think that's kind of part of the whole work. Today's project is that it's kind of bringing CSP into the undergrad math sphere. So CSP is obviously one of the theoretical frameworks that kind of undergirds this study. The second one that I was using was also called practical rationality. So for practical rationality, the idea is that instructors are constrained by professional obligations shaped by values and norms that various stakeholders might have about how instructors should act. So this basically means that instructors can't necessarily do whatever they want. They're bound by certain norms and expectations that other people, other stakeholders at the school, maybe their principal, other educators, society as a whole, we all have these ideas about what teachers should do or what they should be. And then this will necessarily kind of restrict or also impact the things that instructors feel like they are able to do. And I'll get into some of the constructs of practical rationality for a minute, but I first wanted to present this kind of nice quote by Chazen and colleagues. So it says, and yet research on mathematics teaching, like much research on teaching, has struggled to conceptualize and document ways in which instruction is influenced by the fact that it takes place inside institutional schooling with its diverse stakeholders and the structures it creates to accomplish its tasks. At a theoretical level, the field struggles to understand how the existence of instruction inside institutional schooling and believe is what it is that can and cannot happen to interact around mathematics as a subject matter. So hopefully this work is kind of part of answering this call of sort of attending to the institutional context in which CSP or other types of equitable instruction might be taking place. Okay, so for practical rationality, there are generally four main categories for types of obligations that instructors might have to attend to. So the first one has to do with obligations to the discipline of mathematics. So one example of this is teaching content in a way that's consistent with the discipline. If you think proof is a big part of math, then you might feel obligated to introduce proof in a certain manner. There's also obligation to students as individuals. So an example of this might be attending to the well-being of individual students. There's obligation to society and imperatives. So this might mean managing your classroom so that certain interactions kind of align with certain social norms that you think are good for broad society. And finally, there's professional obligation. This is probably the most straightforward. It's kind of about following institutional guidelines. Notably, these categories are descriptive and not prescriptive. For example, for professional obligations, for example, an instructor really might dislike some of their professional obligations. I'm sure that's relatable to a lot of us that we'll have certain things that we don't want to do, but we kind of have to do or are told that we have to do. But they are still part of the things that we have to consider, that instructors have to consider, even if they might not be obligations that instructors might particularly like or take to. So let's kind of situate the study a little bit. So this was an interview study. I recruited 7 math doctoral students. They needed to have taught for at least a semester of undergraduate math. So I sat participants down for one single hour semi-structured interview, and I basically asked them how they might be able to bring culture sustaining practices into their classroom. So the way I did this was that I went recommendation by recommendation and asked them for their thoughts on each one. So the list of recommendations I grabbed was from the New York State Education Department's Culture Responsive Sustainable Education Framework. The fact that it's from New York State is not particularly relevant. It's just this is a helpful list of fairly actionable recommendations. You'll see some of them in a bit. And really the idea is that they're fairly actionable and they're also kind of created by fairly reputable scholars in the field. So we thought that this was fairly reliable to work with. And I really focused on these themes here of making a welcoming and inclusive environment and identifying inclusive curriculum and assessment. Because as we said, part of CSP is also student achievement, but this didn't seem to be the part that I anticipated math instructors would be struggling the most with. I really thought it was kind of creating inclusive environment and inclusive instruction that might be the most difficult or the most kind of different from what they're used to. So I'll just quickly preview some of the recommendations and why they might be helpful and why they might contribute to more, or why they might be related to more equitable practices. So this first one here is to use restorative justice circles and structures to welcome students back into learning when harm has occurred. Really for restorative justice, the way I kind of think about it is that it's sort of an alternative to regular being just kind of entirely punitive and punishing students. It's a way of bringing students in to redress harm and kind of discuss what happened. And then most importantly, it's about welcoming students back into the classroom when learning has occurred. The reason why restorative justice is so important is that it acts kind of as a a disruption of the school to prison pipeline, where frequently Black and Latino students are really punished, expelled, kicked out of the classroom at disproportionate rates. And restorative justice is a way of making sure students are brought back into the classroom, and that we try to minimize kicking people out of our communities as much as possible. So the second recommendation has to do with creating mutually agreed upon norms that students can act out of, that they agree on, so that they're not working out of fear of punishment or desire for a reward. The reason why this recommendation is important is the idea is that it's really promoting student agency. There's a lot of ways that, especially in K-12 classrooms and also in undergraduate classrooms, where students really don't have a lot of agency and their agency isn't really protective or valued. So I think that's kind of the idea behind this recommendation here. The third recommendation is a little bit more aligned with what we might think of when we hear the words culture sustaining. So this is feature and highlight resources written and developed by traditionally marginalized identities that have been silenced or omitted from the curriculum. And then the last recommendation that we'll look at is probably a little more aligned with maybe just general for all good practices. This is building rapport, developing positive relationships with students. So before I jump into the data a little bit, I wanted to quick talk about who my participants were. So I had 7 participants. Collectively, there was 1 Asian man, 4 white men, and 2 white women. Generally speaking, the goal of this wasn't really to generalize to the full population of undergraduate math instructors and to current math PhDs. But it is worth knowing that the kind of population that I had kind of will probably affect the type of results that I got. So I think that's just something to keep in mind here. So for the interviews, again, we talked through each recommendation, and I generally asked the following 4 questions for each recommendation. So the first one was, what are some of the ways you do or can adapt this recommendation to your classroom? The second was, are there any constraints that would make it hard to adapt this recommendation? What kind of resources would you need? And the fourth one has to do with the participants' current practice. So what's currently getting in the way or what's been supporting you? And I think for the purpose of this presentation, I'll really be focusing on the second and the fourth question, so that there have to be constraints, we have things that are kind of obstructing these vectors or getting in the way. And then finally, so for data analysis, I generally did a thematic analysis with semi-open coding, and then codes generally pertain to different obligations that instructors said that they had. Generally speaking, I kept in mind moments when obligations were in conflict or when certain obligations obstructed or enabled sustaining practices. Okay, so now we'll take a little bit into the findings. So generally speaking, instructors perceived various competing commitments that could align or conflict with CSP. And then there were a few obligations. So there were 4 general themes for incidences where there was an obligation that kind of obstructed instructors' ability to do a certain CSP recommendation. So the first category had to do with obligations to the institution. The second had to do with an obligation to be honest with students. The third was an obligation to be an impartial grader. And then the fourth was an obligation to respect student agency. So in this section, I'll just go theme by theme and talk through the different excerpts that participants. So the first theme had to do with institutional obligations. And for this theme, participants were responding to the following 2 recommendations. So it was the restorative justice recommendation, and then the second recommendation about norms and basically promoting student agency. And then once again, restorative justice, we can just think of it as an alternative to punishment that really focuses on addressing harm as opposed to being punitive. Okay, so first we'll hear about Michael. So Michael's responding to restorative justice. And I think one thing that I'll quickly note before I ask everyone to take a look at what he said was that often participants didn't know what restorative justice was. So I gave them a definition and an example. And the example was about dealing with academic dishonesty or student cheating on exam or assignment. So Michael here is specifically responding to that. So I'll give people maybe like a minute to quickly read through and then we'll talk about what Michael has to say. So generally, the things that I wanted to pull out from what Michael was saying here is that, first of all, he said that, if you want to be doing any kind of restorative practices, the instructor really needs to have some agency here. They really need the flexibility to adjudicate things on their own. At the university where Michael works, he finds that there is some of that flexibility. Instructors do have that discretion. But there are universities where this isn't the case, where there's very much a hard rule about what happens to students if they cheat, for example. So he really said in order to allow sort of practicing, you need to have this discretion. Otherwise, what he's saying is that it's impossible. He said that you don't want to be in a situation where your common sense or sympathy is really steering you in one direction, but you have your own job to be concerned with, and that's kind of pulling you in another direction. And ultimately, you're going to have to do what's in the best interest of your job, or at least according to Michael. So the way that I really interpreted this was that an obligation to students to respond non-punitively, to sort of go with what your conscience is saying, can be obstructed by the institutional obligation to follow the various rules for responding to academic dishonesty. All right, so then we'll look at the next so this next recommendation also has to do with institutional obligations. So this again was the recommendation to establish mutually agreed upon norms and to promote student. So give people a minute to read through Nina's excerpt. So what I wanted to highlight from what Nina was saying is that there's sort of an initial setup that's making it very difficult to establish norms that sort of encourage students to act out of a personal responsibility as opposed to feeling kind of more or less coerced to act in a certain way because they'll be punished or they want a certain reward. So Nina's really saying here that this kind of setup makes it hard to have a more global, mutually agreed upon norms and personal responsibility because students intuitively kind of feel like, I don't need to be here. I don't want to take this class. And yet I'm kind of forced to take this class. And that kind of setup inherently makes it very difficult to kind of encourage students to act out of personal responsibility. And I think that there's a few other things kind of operating in the background here where Nina has to assign grades. Nina has to also teach in a certain way that is not useful to the students. She has to teach in a way where she kind of knows students can plug things into Wolfram Alpha, but this is what they're being tested on. So she kind of thinks that these are kind of the things that are constraining her from maybe trying to implement these more global norms. So in this case, the way I interpreted what Nina was saying was that an obligation to promote student agency, so to kind of create global set of norms, is obstructed by an institutional obligation to assign grades given the structure of required prerequisite courses. So I think across those two participants, we're looking at cases where various institutional obligations made it difficult to implement certain CSB practices. So for a second theme, this had to do with an obligation to be honest with students. So in this case, we'll be looking at these two recommendations. So the first one has to do with featuring and highlighting resources by traditionally marginalized voices that have been erased from the curriculum. And the second one has to do with developing rapport and positive relationships with students. Okay, so then we'll quickly take a look at this one. So I'll give people a minute to read through Max's excerpt. And then in Max's case, so the things that I wanted to highlight was that in his own words, he sets fairly high honesty requirements of himself. So he feels that if he's going to present content, he wants to really know what he's talking about. And he feels that he doesn't really understand map history very well. He doesn't want to just read a BuzzFeed article about it and then kind of present that to the class and just sort of say, okay, that's it, I'm good, I'm done. And also there's an element where this isn't really content that Max has been accountable to knowing. He was sort of saying he seems fairly open to knowing some of this, where he said that if this was a requirement, that would be great because then I would know more about it. I think there's also an element of time here where Max could really put in the effort, but he's sort of saying it would take a lot of time. And then that's also. I think that there's also something kind of interesting going on here where the recommendation is not really about history. It's not really necessarily about historical examples, but this is kind of what Max latched onto. And so generally speaking, I kind of work with however my participants were interpreting the recommendation. But I think generally speaking, Max was sort of speaking to a lack of knowledge. So not just of historical math, but also just generally to maybe more diverse resources. So in this case, I interpreted this was an obligation to present accurate material conflicts with the recommendation to highlight historically marginalized perspectives, given a lack of prior knowledge. And in this case, this conflict only really exists because of the lack of prior knowledge. Okay, so then the next recommendation has to do with building rapport in relationships with students. So I'll have everyone take a look at what Owen has to say. So in this case, there's a few different things going on here. So Owen feels an obligation to be fairly frank with students about what's going on, basically, the fact that they're getting grades and these grades are going to determine whether they persist in the major, whether they're admitted to certain schools. And he finds this in his words stupid and frustrating. And he says, I don't believe in it. And he took the time to express this to his students. But also he's acknowledging this is not doing anything to the system as it exists. I'm just kind of naming this with the students. But then there's kind of also another tension going on where this is also kind of a hard conversation to have while maintaining rapport with students. You want to maintain a rapport with students where you're kind of encouraging them to feel motivated to do the work. And it's very much hard to do this if you're telling them that what they're doing is kind of pointless and stupid. So this is also an element of constraint. And then finally, there's this last element here where this is a very difficult conversation. And that there's also an expected kind of rapport he's expected to develop with students. And there's a way he's supposed to be delivering information to them. And this is very much not aligned with what he thinks is best practices or with what best practices probably are in general. So there's kind of a few different layers of things that are kind of conflicting here. So the way I interpreted this was that an obligation to be honest with students, so to really say look, this is what's going on and this is how you're being evaluated. This is really conflicting with the obligation to maintain a rapport that doesn't basically discourage them. And that doesn't, so there's a bit of a conflict here between being honest and also kind of not being overly honest in a way where students might feel disempowered. Okay, and then so the third thing that we'll look at is the obligation to be impartial. So this one was interesting. Both participants felt that an obligation to be impartial kind of obstructed, in this case, in both cases, this specific recommendation to build rapport and develop positive relationships with students, and to find ways to address and incorporate their opinions and concerns. So first we have Jin here. So yeah, we'll give people a little bit, this is a bit shorter. Jin. Yeah, so I think from what Jin was saying, he says that it's in his point of view, it's helpful if his relationship with students is purely academic, because he really feels that the main priority for him and his point of view is to give an impartial grade, and that this impartiality will be jeopardized if he has a personal relationship with students. And I think it was a little bit unclear the extent to which he was sort of saying this to kind of explain why he didn't want to have a personal relationship with students. He does seem somewhat open to it. He did say at the end, like, I think it could be fine after the class is over. So in this case, it was the idea of having to give an impartial grade that was sort of obstructing the idea of building any kind of relationship or rapport with students. So the way I interpreted this was that an obligation to provide impartial assessment conflicted with the recommendation to build rapport and get to know students. Our next participant was like a little bit similar, but I think it didn't necessarily hinge so much on assessment. So we'll quickly hear from Michael. Okay, yeah, so then in Michael's case, he's saying something that's a little bit similar to what Jin was saying earlier. So he was saying, you want to maintain some kind of distance between instructor and students. He doesn't want what he's calling a conflict of interest type situation. And I think specifically, this could be about grades, but specifically, he just doesn't want to socially show favoritism. And that this is kind of a big obstacle to trying to build rapport with students, is that when you reach out to them, the type of students you might reach out to might show a certain type of favoritism, might kind of unload some of the internal biases you have. And he's saying this isn't good. So it's probably best to kind of just treat everyone the same and to not really show any favoritism. So basically the interpretation here was that Michael felt an obligation to treat students equally conflicted with the recommendation to build rapport to get to know students. There's one more thing that I wanted to say was that in this case, Michael was proposing an idea of equity that's not really aligned with what we would maybe consider as equitable practices. In this case, again, this idea that building rapport with some students would be inequitable was real to Michael. This is something that we can obviously problematize, but this is a real contradiction that exists in Michael's head. Okay, so then our fourth and final theme has to do with an obligation to respect student agency and feedback. And so for here, the two recommendations were to work toward creating an environment that establishes mutually agreed upon norms and encourages students to act out of a sense of personal responsibility to follow these norms, not from a fear of personal judgment or desire for reward. And then the second recommendation has to do with incorporating bringing the daily lives of students into instructional content, maybe bringing culture-specific examples or youth culture. And then, so I know this is a lot of quotes. This is the second to last one, I promise. But yeah, so we'll read from Michael again. So this has to do with the mutually agreed upon norms. So in this case, what I pulled out from Michael is saying is that he does seem to value this norm of having students work together. And I think what he was saying was about having students view learning as well. But he was saying that depending on the type of environment you have and the type of grading scheme, so for example, if your university is great or your class is grading on a curve, this might discourage students from wanting to work together entirely. And there's this idea of like, look, if he gets a good grade and that's going to affect me, then maybe we don't work together. And he said that, once this kind of differs semester to semester, one semester he did get a particularly good group where students did want to work together. But he was sort of saying, if you try and they don't really want to work together, you just kind of have to be content. He said as a professor or TA, you can't really force people together. He kind of claims that you can do that at K through 12, which I guess is somewhat debatable, but he was saying that, we're working with undergraduates, they're adults who can't really, there's certain things that you can enforce and that you can't enforce here. And I think I just want to quickly note that there's also a bit of an institutional barrier kind of lurking in the background here where this very much is less of a problem if we're not working with a grading system that is adversarial among students. If students are kind of graded in a way where they can be more collaborative, then this doesn't become an issue. But in some cases, this is a real issue, right? Where you do want students to collaborate, but if they don't want to, you're kind of stuck. So ultimately, in this case, an obligation to respect student agency conflicts with the desire to establish a norm of collaboration when students ultimately don't really want to work together. And our final quote, so the recommendation here has to do with bringing in culture-specific examples from students' lives into the classroom. So we'll quickly hear from Owen. So the things I wanted to highlight specifically was that Owen felt, and from his experience, he saw that undergraduates were sometimes frustrated if you brought content that wasn't directly going to be part of the curriculum or stuff that they were going to be assessed on. And he found that there were moments where first 5 minutes of class, he tried to bring in a cool math video or something else that was kind of cool for mathematics. And he did this maybe a few too many times, and students in the mid-year review said, please stop doing this. And he said his interpretation of this was that, I think that's a signal that there are people who don't want to be inspired, they just want to get this done. That might be a cool math problem, but I have an exam. And I think to be clear, like this might sound kind of derogatory at the end, but earlier in the interview, Owen did talk about how there is a 30 to 40% failure rate for calculus at this university. And Owen was very sympathetic to the fact that a lot of times, I think similarly to what Nina was saying, a lot of students don't want to be there. And it's kind of a shame that they have to be in this class and they have to learn content that they're not interested in and that this content cannot be adjusted. And I think once again, there's this kind of another institutional barrier kind of lurking in the background here where this problem only sort of exists because of this prerequisite course structure, right? Like if students got to opt into the courses they want to take, then or if you got to change the material that would be on the exam, then maybe this kind of thing wouldn't happen. Unfortunately, as it stands, an obligation to engage student feedback, in this case, sort of, I guess, to not include the 5 minutes of extra math, conflicts with the desire to provide engaging content outside of the standard curriculum. And one more thing that I wanted to note here was that I wouldn't necessarily say that what Owen was doing here necessarily aligns with the recommendation. The recommendation is to kind of bring aspects of students' daily lives and culture-specific examples. It's possible that had he actually done that, maybe it was different. But he was kind of responding to this recommendation. And I think that it kind of does stand that, you can bring in other really great things, but if students aren't going to be assessed on them, there is this concern that they're not going to be engaged and that they might want you to not do that anymore. So in summary, relatively little scholarship has really documented actively supportive practices that disrupt a lot of racialized and gendered norms and experiences in math and undergrad math. So generally the findings that we had in terms of why instructors might have difficulties implementing CSP had to do with institutional obligations, an obligation to be honest with students, an obligation to be impartial, and an obligation to respect student agency or to engage student feedback. And I think across a lot of these, there is sort of this overall theme that it's important to attend to institutional context and that the broader kind of institutional rules ended up governing the existence of some of these like obligation conflicts. But notably, I think all of these were examples of participants saying like, I want to do that, but I can't. And that's not the full story. There actually were some cases where participants did kind of push back against constraints that existed. And there weren't many of them. They weren't huge, but they did exist. And I think we should talk about them. So the first one, this is very long, so we'll read through this one together. But Leah basically said that as a TA, she administered a quiz. She found that 2 students had cheated. At the time, she was working under an instructor who was fairly lenient. And because this was a small assignment, she had the agency to sort of take matters into her own hands. She met with both students, she talked to them, and then she implemented some consequences. And she said, I didn't really let them pick the punishment, but I did talk to them about it. Generally speaking, she said that she prefers this way of handling things because she at least gets to have a conversation with students as opposed to kind of just referring them to some sort of academic dishonesty board and then that being that. However, there was a moment when she was instructor of record and she was answering to a course coordinator. And when a student did cheat and it was a final exam, the course coordinator said, okay, you have to report. And then she did indeed report. So at first, kind of similar to what Michael was saying, where like, depending on the situation you're in, you might be able to do things on your own and maybe in a less punitive way, or you might not be able to at all. But one thing that was interesting was that Leah said, technically you're supposed to submit or file cases no matter what, if it's a homework, if it's a small assignment, that's technically what the rules are. But if someone copies off of someone else for a homework, I'm not gonna submit it. But that seems like too heavy a consequence. That seems like too heavy bureaucracy. I could get in trouble for this. They could come after me. The student might be upset, but I'm not doing it. And I thought this was very interesting. And part of me is like, again, this is sort of, I think when we saw from the last quote, Leah's not like 100% like raging against the system, but there also are these little ways that she's kind of subverting. She's sort of saying like, if it's a homework assignment, that's too much. Like, that's kind of where I draw the line. And then, so in some cases, and particularly in this case, an obligation to the student really overruled an institutional obligation to report cheating or to report academic dishonesty. So we're going back to Owen. So we saw a little bit of this quote earlier. So he talked about how during calculus exams, he was required to escort students to the bathroom. And he really didn't like this. He really didn't like that he was infantilizing students, that he felt like he was complicit in infantilizing students in this way. So he kind of joked with them. He said like, this is ridiculous. Like, are you 5? He said that he would try to apologize to them. And this was kind of his way of like pushing back a little bit. Granted, this wasn't a huge affront to the system, but this was a small way of pushing back. And he talked about, and we saw a little bit of this earlier, where he tries to be frank with his students and sort of say like, you're being evaluated in this way. I don't think it's right. And these are my thoughts on it. And then he kind of says like, I don't really want people to suffer. This isn't really Marxism, but he feels like this is getting Marxist. And then he said that I feel like it's part of my job as a TA to not let the system eat these people as much as possible. And I think this was, nice, because even though these were kind of small, like verbal, like subversions, this did kind of show that Owen felt a kind of obligation in a way to push back against systemic barriers that were kind of harming students. So then in this case, an obligation to students motivated a subversion of professional obligations. So I just kind of want to quickly talk about like, maybe kind of some of the implications of some of this work. So prior work has really shown that equitable instruction needs to directly confront racialized or gender inequalities in math. So as I said somewhat earlier, general for all practices can only bring you so far. They're really not enough to directly confront a lot of these issues. And then generally, if we want instructors to directly subvert institutional ideologies and practices, so likely to an extent like Owen, which we absolutely do, it's crucial to understand their perceived commitments that they balance as university employees. And I also just wanted to underscore this perceived commitments bit here, because I think as we saw across participants, there were places where there are some obligations that I know I personally felt wouldn't have been in conflict for me, probably for many of you as well. But these are real to the instructors, and these are preventing these instructors from doing these recommendations. So they do need to be contended with, even if they don't need to be agreed with. And then finally, prior work has indicated that instructors need pedagogical content knowledge and understandings of how students use math outside of school. I think how the participants responded to some of the recommendations suggests that maybe there's other forms of knowledge that they might also need, maybe math history knowledge, maybe understandings of ways that math can be brought into, how we can leverage math from students' everyday lives.